The morning mist clung to Lake Bodom like a funeral shroud. Risto Saren's measured footfalls along his usual jogging path came to an abrupt halt when he spotted the collapsed tent through the fog. Something was wrong. The canvas, once a pristine shelter against the elements, lay crumpled and torn, its surface stained dark with what he would soon realize was blood. Two motorcycles stood propped against nearby trees, their chrome dulled by the morning dew. As Risto approached, the details emerged like a nightmare slowly coming into focus. A pale hand protruded from beneath the ruined tent. Then he saw them, bodies, young and broken. Their summer camping adventure turned to horror. 3 teenagers lay dead. Miley Bjorklund, found partially undressed, had been savaged with particular brutality. Seppo Antero Boisman and Anya Tulikimaki lay tangled within the tent's remains. The 4th teenager, Nils Willem Gustafsson, still drew ragged breaths despite his grievous injuries, a fractured jaw, concussion, and a deep stab wound to his forehead. The peaceful Finnish lakeside had transformed into a tableau of violence. Risto's trembling hands could barely manage the phone call to police, his voice breaking as he tried to explain the scene before him. By noon, the area would be swarming with investigators and, in a tragic misstep, curious civilians invited by police to help search for evidence. The morning sun rose higher, burning away the mist to reveal scattered possessions, wallets and clothing items strewn some 500 meters from the tent. A set of footprints led away from the scene, made by shoes that would later be identified as belonging to the lone survivor. The tranquil waters of Lake Bodom reflected the sky above, offering no answers to the horror on its shores. The investigation begins. The Finnish police arrived at Lake Bodom shortly after noon, stepping into what would become their nation's most infamous crime scene. Their first critical error revealed itself within hours, a public call for civilian volunteers to help search the area. Dozens of locals trampled through the crime scene, destroying vital evidence in their eagerness to assist. Detective Matti Palerno surveyed the chaos with growing dismay. Footprints, potentially crucial to the investigation, became indistinguishable among the crowd's movements. Only one set remained clear. Tracks leading away from the scene, made by shoes later identified as belonging to Nils Gustafsson, the sole survivor. The scattered evidence painted a puzzling picture. Wallets and clothing items lay strewn approximately 500 meters from the tent, seemingly discarded at random. Nils's shoes, found hidden nearby, bore traces of the victim's blood, but, curiously, none of his own. The murder weapons, believed to be a knife and a blunt object, remained frustratingly elusive despite the mass search effort. 2 young birdwatchers came forward with an intriguing detail. Earlier that morning, they'd observed a blond man with longer hair walking away from the area. A local fisherman corroborated the sighting. The description would later match that given by Nils under hypnosis, his memory of the attack fragmented by trauma and injury. At the Red Cross station, Nils struggled to provide coherent answers to investigators' questions. His initial statement described a black-cloaked figure with red eyes, a detail investigators attributed to his concussed state. The medical examination revealed the brutal extent of the attacks. Miley had suffered the worst, with evidence of overkill suggesting a personal motive. As day faded to dusk, the investigation had already been compromised. Critical evidence lay contaminated or destroyed beneath hundreds of civilian footprints. The killer's trail, if one had existed, vanished among the chaos. Lake Bodom kept its secrets, while somewhere nearby, a murderer walked free, perhaps even watching the investigation unfold. moving backward. June 4th, 1960, dawned bright and full of promise in the Finnish countryside. Summer had finally arrived at Lake Bodom, bringing with it the eternal optimism of youth. 4 teenagers prepared for what they hoped would be a romantic adventure, unaware they were heading toward a date with darkness that would haunt their nation for generations. Nils Willem Gustafsson and Miley Björklund had been dating for several months. At 18, Nils was 3 years older than his 15-year-old girlfriend, a common age gap for the era. Their friends, Seppo Antero Boisman and Anja Tulikinaki, mirrored their age difference. The 4 had planned this camping trip carefully, choosing Lake Bodom for its reputation as a lover's getaway. The afternoon sun glinted off their motorcycles as they wound their way through the Finnish countryside. They'd packed light, just a simple canvas tent, basic supplies, and the infinite possibilities that youth brings to a summer evening. Upon reaching the lake, they selected their campsite with the careful deliberation of those seeking both privacy and beauty. A gentle slope near the tree line that offered a perfect view of the water. Miley's diary, recovered later, captured the ordinary magic of those final hours. She wrote of shared jokes and stolen kisses, of the boys showing off as they secured their motorcycles against the pine trees and erected the tent. The entry contained no hint of danger, no premonition of the horror to come. Just the simple joys of young love and friendship, preserved in ink that would soon be stained with darker meanings. As twilight settled over Lake Bodom, the teenagers gathered inside their tent. Perhaps they shared their dreams for the future, Nils's plans for his career, Miley's hopes for further education, Seppo and Anja's own aspirations. They might have told ghost stories, their nervous laughter carrying across the still waters, or shared secrets that seemed monumental in the cocoon of their youth. The night air carried the scent of pine and possibility. Between 4 and 6 a.m., their world exploded into violence. The killer struck with savage efficiency, never entering the tent but attacking through the canvas itself. The murder weapons, believed to be a knife and a blunt object, tore through fabric and flesh alike. In the chaos, the tent collapsed, its supports giving way as the teenagers fought for their lives in the pre-dawn darkness. Miley bore the brunt of the attacker's fury. The overkill nature of her wounds suggested a deeply personal rage, leading investigators to later theorize that she had been the primary target. Was it her relationship with Nils that had triggered such hatred? Her partially unclothed state raised questions that would haunt the investigation for decades. The others, perhaps attempting to protect her, or simply caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, met similarly violent ends, all except Nils, whose survival would eventually cast him under a shadow of suspicion. The suspects emerge. Assman. The morning after the murders, a man arrived at Helsinki Hospital whose presence would haunt the investigation for decades to come. Assman, a German expatriate with a dark past, exhibited behavior that immediately aroused suspicion. He alternated between violent outbursts and periods of seemingly feigned unconsciousness, his erratic actions putting the hospital staff on edge. His clothes bore suspicious red stains that the medical staff would later swear under oath was blood. His fingernails were black, caked with an unknown substance that he refused to explain. And when asked for identification, he provided credentials that proved to be false. Assman's background read like a character from a Cold War thriller, each detail more sinister than the last. As a former SS officer, he had served as a guard at Auschwitz during World War II, participating in one of history's darkest chapters. His path took an unexpected turn when he fell in love with a Jewish woman and fled Germany, only to be captured by Soviet forces. Rather than face punishment, he was recruited by the KGB, becoming a spy in Finland's quiet countryside. Now he lived just 5 kilometers from Lake Bodom, close enough to hear the teenagers' laughter that fatal night, close enough to track their movements undetected. The investigation took a chilling turn when Nils underwent hypnosis to recover his memories of the attack. The resulting police sketch bore an uncanny resemblance to Assman, capturing his distinctive features with haunting accuracy. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source: a photograph taken at the victim's funeral. Among the mourners stood Assman himself, his face matching the witness sketch with such precision that investigators were stunned. His presence at the funeral, watching the grieving families of his possible victims, suggested either extraordinary brazenness or a psychopathic need to revisit his crimes. When descriptions of the killer began circulating, Assman made a telling move. He suddenly cut his long brown hair, the same distinctive hair that witnesses had described seeing on the man leaving the crime scene. Dr. Jorma Palo, one of the doctors who had examined Assman at the hospital, became so convinced of his guilt that he went on to write 3 books exploring the connection between Assman and the murders. Yet the Finnish police seemed strangely reluctant to pursue him as a serious suspect. Rumors circulated that political pressure from the Soviet Union had dampened their investigative enthusiasm, the Cold War casting its long shadow over the case. Detective Matti Palerno grew increasingly frustrated as his investigation was repeatedly stalled. He believed Assman was not only responsible for the Bodom murders, but potentially linked to 5 other unsolved killings, including the murder of Kilpisjärvi less than 10 months later. Despite the mounting evidence, Assman remained free, protected perhaps by the complex web of international politics that had brought him to Finland's shores in the first place. The Kiosk Man. Carl Valdemar Gillström cast a long shadow over Lake Bodom. His small kiosk, less than half a kilometer from the murder site, served as his vantage point to monitor the comings and goings around his territory. Known for his volcanic temper, Gillström had earned a fearsome reputation among locals. He didn't just dislike trespassers, he actively terrorized them, particularly targeting young campers with a fury that seemed to transcend ordinary irritation. Children learned to avoid his property after seeing him hurl rocks at their peers. Teenagers seeking romantic lakeside retreats found themselves driven away by his aggressive threats. His rage seemed to intensify with each passing summer, focusing particularly on those who dared to pitch tents near his domain. This fixation on campers would later draw investigators' attention when 4 teenagers set up their tent within his self-proclaimed territory. On the night of the murders, Gillström's wife provided him with what seemed an airtight alibi, swearing he had been in bed beside her. But this alibi harbored a dark secret that would remain hidden for decades. As she lay on her deathbed, Mrs. Gillström finally revealed the truth. Her husband had threatened to kill her if she ever spoke about his absence that night. She died carrying the weight of this knowledge, firmly believing her husband was the Lake Bodom murderer. In the years following the murders, Gillström's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He made not 1 but 4 separate drunken confessions to neighbors, each time claiming responsibility for the teenagers' deaths. Perhaps most suspiciously, days after the murders, he hastily filled in the well on his property, a well that some locals believed contained the missing murder weapons and other evidence. His peculiar actions sparked whispers that continued for decades, yet authorities never excavated the site. The final chapter of Gillström's story played out in the very waters that had witnessed the murders. In 1969, overcome by what many believed to be guilt, he chose Lake Bodom as the site of his suicide. He left behind a note confessing one last time to the murders, before walking into the dark waters that had kept so many secrets. The lake claimed him just as it had claimed the truth about that terrible night 9 years earlier. The timing and location of his suicide struck many as a final admission of guilt. Others saw it as the desperate act of a troubled man who had convinced himself of his own culpability. To this day, The filled-in well on his property stands as a silent monument to the mysteries he took to his watery grave. The investigation reopens. 44 years after the murders, Lake Bodom's waters stirred once again. Nils Gustafsson, now 63, had built a seemingly normal life, a long career as a bus driver, a marriage, 2 grown children. But the past wasn't finished with him. In 2004, Finnish police arrested the lone survivor, charging him with the murders of his teenage companions. New forensic analysis had revealed troubling details about his shoes found near the crime scene. They contained the victim's blood but none of his own, an oddity that investigators couldn't explain away. The prosecution painted a picture of jealous rage, suggesting that Nils had attacked his girlfriend Miley in a drunken fury when she refused his advances. The others, they claimed, were merely witnesses who had to be silenced. The National Bureau of Investigation declared the case closed, confident they'd finally caught their killer. Yet the defense argued persuasively that Nils's own injuries, the concussion, fractured jaw, and facial wounds, were too severe to be self-inflicted. Could he really have overpowered 3 people while so grievously wounded? In 2005, after serving just 1 year in prison, Nils was acquitted. The evidence, deteriorated by time, and compromised by the chaos of that first investigation, couldn't support a conviction. He walked free, maintaining his innocence with the simple statement, "I'm innocent. That's that." Today, Lake Bodom's dark waters still harbor their secrets. The case has woven itself into Finland's cultural fabric, inspiring the metal band Children of Bodom and a 2016 horror film that drew international acclaim. 3 generations of Finnish children have grown up warned not to stay out late for fear of the Bodom murderer. The evidence points in multiple directions. Hans Assman's suspicious hospital visit, an eerie resemblance to witness descriptions, the Kiosk Man's repeated confessions, and his wife's deathbed revelation, Nils' improbable survival, and the unexplained blood evidence. Each theory leaves questions unanswered, threads that lead nowhere. Perhaps the truth lies buried in that filled-in well on the Kiosk Man's property, or hidden in classified KGB files about Assman's activities. Or maybe it died with Nils's memories of that terrible night, shattered by trauma and the passage of time. Lake Bodom's mystery endures as Finland's most notorious unsolved crime, a reminder that sometimes the deepest wounds never heal, and the darkest secrets never surface, even in the clearest waters.